Hey, old man, I said stop. The shout cut through the quiet street like a slap. Earl Thompson froze mid-step, one worn shoe hovering just above the cracked pavement. His grocery bag in his left hand sagged under the weight of canned soup and day-old bread. His right hand tightened around his wooden cane. Slowly, carefully, he turned. Two police cruisers sat at the curb, lights flashing, though there was no traffic, no emergency, no reason for all that noise. One officer leaned against the hood, arms crossed, chewing gum like he had nowhere else to be. The other stood closer, hand resting on his belt, eyes already narrowed. "What's the problem, officer?" Earl asked calmly. His voice was steady, old but steady. The closer officer scoffed. "Problem is, you didn't cross at the corner." Earl glanced behind him. The crosswalk was less than 10 steps away. "I didn't see any cars," he said gently. "I've lived on this block 40 years, never had an issue before." "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped. "You think the law bends because you've been around a while?" The gum-chewing officer laughed. "They always say that." Earl felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but something heavier, a memory, a warning, the kind that came from a lifetime of knowing how quickly a simple conversation could turn dangerous. "I'm just trying to get home," Earl said. "My knees aren't what they used to be." The officer stepped closer. "You should have thought about that before you broke the law." Earl blinked. "Sir, with respect, I didn't—" "Hands where I can see them." The command was sharp, loud enough that nearby apartment windows creaked open, curtains shifted, someone's television muted. Earl slowly released his cane with one hand and raised both palms, the grocery bag slipping from his fingers and hitting the ground with a dull thud. A can rolled into the gutter. "I'm not resisting," he said. "No one said you were, yet." The other officer straightened up, eyes scanning Earl like he was inspecting a suspicious package. "Name," he said. "Earl Thompson. Date of birth, July 14th, 1943. The gum-chewing officer raised his brows. "Damn, you're ancient." The word hit harder than the shove that followed. "Hey!" Earl stumbled as the officer nudged him back, his cane clattering against the sidewalk. "I said stand still." "I am standing," Earl said, breath shallow now. "Please, you don't need to push me." The officer leaned in close enough that Earl could smell coffee and mint gum. "You don't tell me what I need to do." A phone camera clicked on somewhere across the street. Another voice whispered, "Leave him alone." "Back up!" The officer barked toward the sound. "This doesn't concern you." Earl's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. Not panic, not yet, but something worse, humiliation. At 81 years old, he'd buried a wife, raised 2 children, worked 37 years for the city sanitation department, paid his taxes, served his community, and survived a lifetime of moments just like this. And here he was, hands up, groceries spilled, treated like a threat. "Run his name," the officer said. The other officer pulled out the cruiser tablet, tapping lazily. "Probably got a record," he muttered. "They always do." Earl closed his eyes briefly. Not a prayer, a memory. Black and white photographs, a badge that no longer shined, a name he hadn't spoken out loud in decades. The tablet beeped. The gum-chewing officer frowned. "Huh. What?" the officer asked. "System's lagging. Try again." He did. The frown deepened. "That's weird." "What is?" "It's pulling something old, like real old." Earl opened his eyes. The officer turned the tablet toward his partner. "Look at this." The closer officer leaned in, smirk already fading. "What the hell?" His posture changed, just slightly. "What?" Earl asked quietly. The officer didn't answer him. He stared at the screen, scrolled again. Then his face went pale. "You said your name was Earl Thompson?" "Yes." "Born 1943? "Yes." The officer swallowed. The gum-chewing officer stepped closer, no longer chewing. Sarge, he said into his radio, we need you down here. Why? Came the crackled reply. Because I think we just stopped someone who's in the records. What records? The old ones. A long pause. How old? The officer glanced at Earl, really looked at him now. Department archives, pre-1970. The radio crackled again. Don't move him, and for God's sake, be respectful. The word hung in the air like a bad joke. Earl lowered his hands slowly, joints aching. I told you, I was just trying to get home. Across the street, more phones were up now, and for the first time since the sirens began, the officers looked unsure.
The sirens were still flashing, but no one seemed to notice anymore. They had gone from a warning to a spotlight, red and blue washing over Earl Thompson's lined face, his silver hair, the quiet patience in his eyes. He stood exactly where they'd left him, groceries spilled at his feet, Kane still lying on the sidewalk like an afterthought. The younger officer kept glancing at the cruiser tablet, scrolling, stopping, scrolling again, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less troubling. "Sir," he said finally, voice lower now, "have you ever worked with law enforcement?" Earl didn't answer right away. He looked past the officer, past the cruisers, past the small gathering of neighbors pretending not to stare. He watched a pigeon hop along the curb, pecking at a crumb near his fallen bread. "Yes," Earl said at last, "a long time ago." The officer's jaw tightened. The gum-chewing officer, who hadn't touched his gum in several minutes, cleared his throat. "The system says you were issued a badge number." Earl nodded once. "And a service weapon." Another nod. "And that you resigned in 1968. Silence settled over the street like dust. The younger officer stepped back slightly, as if Earl had suddenly grown larger. "That's not possible," he muttered. "Our department didn't even... didn't what?" Earl asked gently. The officer hesitated. "Didn't have many officers who looked like you back then." Earl gave a small, tired smile. "No, you didn't." A black SUV rolled to a stop behind the cruisers. A man in his late 50s stepped out, salt and pepper hair, pressed uniform, shoulders heavy with rank. Sergeant Alan Whitaker, 28 years on the force, known for rules, reputation, and not liking surprises. He took in the scene quickly. The spilled groceries, the phones recording, the officers standing stiff instead of confident, and Earl Thompson, calm, upright, unafraid. Whitaker approached slowly. "Mr. Thompson," he said. "Not sir, not old man, not suspect, just the name." Earl met his gaze. "That's me." Whitaker held out a hand. Earl looked at it for a moment before taking it. The handshake was brief but firm. "I'm Sergeant Whitaker," the man said. "I apologize for the confusion." Confusion. Earl had heard worse words used to excuse worse actions. Whitaker turned sharply to the officers. "Why is this man standing on the sidewalk with his groceries on the ground?" The younger officer swallowed. "Jaywalking, Sarge?" Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "And that required 2 cruisers?" No answer. "And hands up?" Still nothing. Whitaker exhaled slowly, then looked back at Earl. "May we step over here?" They moved a few feet away, closer to the curb. The officers hovered nearby, suddenly unsure of where to stand or how to look. Whitaker lowered his voice. "Sir, I pulled your file." Earl nodded again. "It took a minute. Those records aren't digitized, haven't been touched in decades. Some things are easier to forget." Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. "You were one of the first." One of many who didn't last, Earl replied. Whitaker hesitated. Your evaluations were exceptional. Earl chuckled softly. They always were, right up until they weren't. What happened? Asked Whitaker. Earl looked at him, really looked at him, as if deciding how much truth this man could carry. I arrested the wrong person, Earl said calmly. Or rather, I refused to arrest the person they wanted. Whitaker's brow furrowed. Explain. 1968, Earl said. A burglary downtown, jewelry store. The suspect description fit half the neighborhood. They wanted a quick close. I found evidence pointing elsewhere. And the other suspect was the son of someone important. Whitaker didn't interrupt. So they told me to adjust my report, just enough to make it fit. And you didn't? Earl shook his head. I believed the badge meant something. Whitaker let out a breath. That didn't go over well. No, it did not. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably behind them. They reassigned me. Then they isolated me, took my partner, took my patrol, took my cases. And then? They offered me a choice, resign quietly or be fired loudly. Whitaker glanced down at the tablet again. The file says voluntary resignation. Earl smiled without humor. It usually does. A woman across the street called out, "What's going on?" Whitaker turned. "Everything's under control, ma'am." But it wasn't, because the truth had surfaced, and truth doesn't go underground easily. Whitaker turned back to Earl. "You should have been protected." "Yes," Earl agreed. "I should have." The sergeant straightened, voice carrying now. "Officers." Both men snapped to attention. "You will apologize to Mr. Thompson." The gum-chewing officer blinked. "Sarge? Now." They turned towards Earl. "I'm sorry," the younger one said, stiffly. The other hesitated, then muttered, "Didn't know." Earl met his eyes. "That's often the problem." Whitaker gestured towards the groceries. "Someone help him pick those up." The younger officer bent quickly, gathering cans, wiping off dirt with his sleeve. Whitaker lowered his voice again. "Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to come down to the station?" Earl raised an eyebrow. "Am I being detained?" "No," Whitaker said firmly. "Invited." "To do what?" Whitaker hesitated. "There are people who need to see you." "People who remember," Earl said. "Yes." Earl looked around, at the watching neighbors, the phones still raised, the officers now standing unsure in the sunlight. "I've spent a lifetime being quiet. What happens if I come?" Whitaker didn't lie. "Things will get uncomfortable." Earl nodded. "They always do." He reached for his cane. The younger officer rushed to pick it up, handing it to him with both hands. Earl accepted it. "I'll come," he said, "but not for you." Whitaker met his gaze. "Then for who?" "For the men who never got their names cleared, and for the ones who never made it home." The street was silent now. Even the phones had lowered. Whitaker nodded once. Understood. As they walked towards the cruiser, not the back seat, but the front, Earl glanced once more at the grocery bag. A can of soup had cracked open, its contents slowly spilling into the gutter. He didn't mind. Some messes were long overdue. And somewhere deep inside the department, doors that had stayed shut for 50 years were about to open.
The police station hadn't changed the way Earl Thompson remembered. The same brick facade, the same narrow windows, the same flag out front, snapping in the breeze like it always had, proud, unmoved by who stood beneath it. What had changed was him. Earl stepped through the front doors with his cane tapping softly against the tile, escorted not as a suspect, but as a guest. Officers along the hallway glanced up from their desks. Some nodded out of respect. Others looked away, suddenly very busy with paperwork. The building knew him. even if the people inside pretended not to. Whitaker led Earl past the bullpen, past holding cells, past a door marked Records, a room Earl remembered too well. "Conference room's this way," Whitaker said. Earl stopped walking. "I want to see my file," he said calmly. Whitaker paused. "You've already seen the summary." "I want the whole thing, unedited." Whitaker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." They turned back. The records room smelled like dust and old paper, the scent of time forgotten. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, labeled in fading ink. A single clerk looked up in surprise as they entered. "Need access to pre-1970 internal affairs," Whitaker said. The clerk blinked. "That section hasn't been—" "I know," Whitaker cut in. "Open it." Keys rattled. A heavy drawer slid open with a metallic groan. Whitaker pulled out a thick folder, its edges yellowed, the name typed in bold black letters. Thompson, 8, Thompson, E-A-R-L, J. Earl's hands trembled slightly as he took it. Inside were memos, evaluations, handwritten notes, and letters. "So many letters," Earl murmured. "Letters," Whitaker frowned. "Complaints, commendations, warnings." He flipped through slowly. There it was. The memo, dated October 14th, 1968. "Officer Thompson has demonstrated an inability to follow directives that align with departmental priorities. His conduct reflects poor judgment and an unwillingness to cooperate with leadership." Earl laughed softly. "That's not how it happened," Whitaker said quietly. "No, it isn't." He turned the page. A handwritten note from a captain long retired, maybe long buried. "Keep an eye on him. He's getting ideas." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "You were targeted." "I was young. I thought doing the right thing was protection enough." Whitaker exhaled. "It should have been." They left the records room and entered the conference room. A long table, fluorescent lights, a pitcher of water untouched at the center. Moments later, the door opened. A man in his 70s entered, walking slowly but upright. Former Chief Robert Klein. He'd been pulled from retirement that morning, summoned by a phone call he couldn't ignore. Behind him came two other men, former commanders, their faces lined with age and memory. Earl stood. Klein froze. "Earl Thompson." "You remember me," Earl replied. Klein swallowed. "Yes." "You were lieutenant then," Earl said. "You signed my resignation." Silence filled the room. Klein took a seat. "We didn't have a choice." "You always had a choice. You just didn't choose me." One of the commanders cleared his throat. "This is, unexpected." "Truth often is," Earl replied. Whitaker stood at the head of the table. "We are here because Officer Thompson's file raises serious questions about departmental conduct during the late 60s. Klein bristled. "Those were different times." "That's not an answer," Whitaker said. Earl spoke calmly. "You let criminals walk free because of who their fathers were." Klein's face reddened. "That's not fair." "You let innocent men go to jail because they were easier." The room went quiet. One of the older men shifted uncomfortably. "If we open this, it won't stop with you." Earl nodded. "It never does." Whitaker turned to Klein. "Did you pressure him to change his report?" Klein hesitated. Whitaker didn't blink. "Yes," Klein said finally. "We did." A breath left Earl's chest he hadn't realized he was holding. "And when he refused?" Whitaker asked. "We removed him," Klein said. Quietly. Whitaker leaned forward. "You ended his career." "You preserved the department," Klein snapped. "At what cost?" Earl asked. Klein didn't answer. Whitaker straightened. There are at least 12 similar cases tied to this period, officers disciplined or dismissed for refusing unlawful directives. One of the commanders muttered, "We buried those files. You tried. You didn't succeed." Klein looked at Earl. "What do you want?" Earl folded his hands on the table. "I want the truth in writing. I want names restored. I want families notified." "And?" Klein asked. "And I want the badge I earned," Earl said softly. "Not to wear, to put away properly." Whitaker nodded. "We'll convene an independent review board." Klein scoffed. "This will destroy reputations." Earl met his gaze. "Good." The door opened suddenly. A young officer stepped in, pale. "Sarge, press is outside." Whitaker closed his eyes briefly. "How many?" "All of them." Earl rose slowly. "Then let them in." Outside, cameras flashed as Earl emerged, flanked not by cuffs but by command staff. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Thompson, were you wrongly forced out? Is it true the department suppressed cases? Is this about racism?" Earl raised a hand. They quieted. "I served this city with honor, and so did many others who were silenced." Whitaker stepped forward. "We are reopening multiple historical cases effective immediately." A murmur swept through the crowd. Earl looked straight into the cameras. "Some truths don't age. They just wait." Inside the station, officers watched from behind glass, some stunned, some proud, some afraid. And deep in the building, files long sealed began to move, because once the past refuses to stay buried, it demands to be heard.
The first thing that cracked wasn't policy, it was silence. Inside the precinct, the air felt different, thicker, charged, like a storm sitting just above the ceiling tiles. Conversations stopped when supervisors walked by. Radios stayed quieter than usual. Officers who'd worked together for decades suddenly found reasons not to make eye contact. Earl Thompson's name echoed down hallways that had tried to forget it. In the locker room, Officer Luis Ramirez sat on a bench tying his boots, staring at the floor. Across from him, Sergeant Bill Haskins slammed his locker shut harder than necessary. "This is a witch hunt," Haskins muttered, "dragging up ancient history like it's got anything to do with us." Ramirez didn't respond. Haskins scoffed. "What, you got something to say?" Ramirez finished tying his boot. "Just thinking." "About what?" Haskins snapped. "About how many times I was told to look the other way," Ramirez said quietly, "and didn't." Haskins stared at him. "You accusing someone?" Ramirez finally looked up. "I'm accusing the silence." Across the hall, Lieutenant Sarah McNeil stood at the briefing room door, listening. 20 years on the force, 2 commendations, 1 internal complaint she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it never happened. Almost. She walked into her office and shut the door. On her desk sat an email from Chief Whitaker. All supervisors are required to submit any knowledge of historical misconduct, undocumented directives, or informal pressures relevant to the 1960 to 1980 period. Full cooperation is expected. Sarah sat down slowly. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. She remembered the night her training officer told her, "You'll last longer if you don't ask why." She remembered nodding. She remembered obeying. Downstairs, Officer Daniels, the same man who'd stopped Earl for the broken taillight, sat alone in the patrol car bay, helmet off, elbows on his knees. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Earl's calm face, the way he didn't raise his voice, the way he carried decades of weight without asking anyone to hold it. Daniels had joined the force believing rules were clean things, right and wrong, black and white. Now everything felt gray. Whitaker walked through the bay, stopping in front of him. "You okay?" Daniels hesitated. "Sir, was he really one of us?" Whitaker nodded. "Better than most." Daniels swallowed. "Then why did we forget him?"
Whitaker didn't answer right away, because forgetting is easier than fixing. Up on the second floor, the old guard gathered. Retired officers, some called back for interviews, others who came on their own, filled the small meeting room. Gray hair, stiff backs, faces that had once commanded streets. Former Chief Klein sat at the head of the table, jaw tight. "They're turning this into a circus, dragging our names through the mud." Klein rubbed his temples. "We did what we had to do." "Did we?" another asked softly. Heads turned. It was Frank Delaney, once a patrolman, later a desk officer. He'd kept his mouth shut for 40 years, until now. "We told ourselves that, but we all knew why Earl had to go." Klein snapped. "Don't start," Delaney continued. "He wrote the report, the real one, and it scared people." "Because it threatened the department," Klein said. "No," Delaney replied, "because it threatened comfort." Silence fell. Across the room, a younger captain stood, arms crossed. "If this goes public, lawsuits will follow. Families, retirements revoked." Delaney nodded. "Good." Someone scoffed. "You want to burn it all down?" "I want to stop lying about the fire." Elsewhere, reporters camped outside the precinct, broadcasting live. Headlines scrolled across screens in break rooms and homes across the city. Decades-old police files reopened. Former officer claims retaliation for refusing corruption. Department faces historical reckoning. Phones rang non-stop. City Hall called. The mayor called. The union called. Whitaker ignored most of them. In his office, he sat alone with Earl Thompson. "You could have walked away. You don't owe this department anything." Earl smiled faintly. "I didn't do this for the department." "Then why?" Whitaker asked. Earl looked out the window at the flag. "Because there are young officers in this building who still think the badge means truth." Whitaker nodded slowly. That afternoon, the Internal Review Board convened for the first time in 50 years. Files were opened. Names were read. Patterns emerged. Unwritten rules, quiet punishments, careers ended without paperwork. The blue wall wasn't just thick, it was layered, and every layer told the same story. By evening, 3 supervisors submitted written statements admitting to knowledge of informal directives discouraging certain arrests and encouraging others. By nightfall, 2 retirees requested legal counsel. By morning, the union issued a statement calling the investigation divisive. Whitaker responded with one sentence: "Truth divides lies from facts." In the locker room, Ramirez stood beside Daniels, both changing into street clothes. "Do you think this'll change anything?" Daniels asked. Ramirez shrugged. "Maybe not everything." "But," Daniels pressed, "but maybe the next kid with a clean report won't get punished for it." Daniels nodded. At home that night, Sarah McNeil opened her laptop. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she began to type. "In 1999, I was instructed by a superior to alter language in an arrest report to avoid departmental scrutiny." Her hand shook, but she didn't stop. Back at the precinct, a framed photograph was removed from the wall, a group of officers smiling at a retirement party in 1971. Someone noticed Earl Thompson standing at the edge of the photo, half cropped out. Someone else quietly rehung it, centered. The reckoning wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was steady, like pressure finally released after decades. And inside the blue wall, cracks were spreading, not from anger, but from conscience.
The city didn't explode when the story broke. It inhaled, hard, and then it held its breath. By sunrise, Earl Thompson's name was everywhere, scrolling across morning news tickers, murmured over coffee counters, whispered in barber shops, spoken carefully in church pews where memory had always sat heavier than confession. Former officer forced out after refusing to alter arrest records. Elderly man stopped for taillight, turns out to be department whistleblower. What else was buried? People still argue about which headline did the most damage. Some say it was the word forced. Others say it was refusing. But the ones who had lived long enough knew the real earthquake came from something else entirely.
The dates, the years, the quiet realization that this wasn't about one bad stop or one good man. It was about time and what happens when it's used to hide instead of heal. By mid-morning, City Hall was surrounded by cameras. Not protesters yet, just journalists at first, their voices clipped and urgent, repeating the same question in slightly different ways. How deep does this go? Who knew? Why now? Inside, the mayor paced his office, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at a framed photo of himself shaking hands with police leadership during last year's charity run. "You're telling me this sat for 40 years?" he asked his chief of staff. The woman nodded, and that Thompson tried to report it back then. The mayor rubbed his face, and no one listened. "They listened," she corrected gently. "They chose quiet." Across town, in a small community center with peeling paint and folding chairs that never quite lined up, a different meeting was already underway. No press, no microphones, just people, mostly older, some with canes, some with hands folded so tightly their knuckles looked bleached, faces that had seen police lights in their rearview mirrors long before dashboards had computers. Earl sat in the second row, not speaking. He hadn't planned to come, but word had spread, the old kind of word, past mouth to ear, layered with memory. "He's here," someone whispered. A woman stood up at the front, Mrs. Lillian Brooks, 82, former school secretary. She didn't read from notes. "I remember when Officer Thompson was on patrol. He walked my grandson home after someone stole his bike. Didn't ask questions, didn't scare him, just walked." Heads nodded. A man near the back cleared his throat. "I remember when he stopped my brother, let him go with a warning, said fix the light, don't let them tell you you're broken." Earl looked down. The woman continued. "And I remember when he disappeared. No announcement, no goodbye, just gone." Her voice shook. "We thought we'd done something wrong." Silence settled, not empty, but heavy with recognition. Earl finally stood. "I didn't come to be remembered. I came because a young officer treated me like I mattered, and that meant something." He paused, choosing his words like fragile tools. "I don't want anger. I don't want revenge. I want honesty, because lies age badly, and they make everyone sick." Someone clapped, then another. Not loud, not celebratory, grateful. Across the city, the police union held a press conference. The spokesperson's smile was tight. "We acknowledge concerns raised by recent reports, but we caution against rewriting history through the lens of modern standards." That sentence lit the fuse. Call-in shows exploded. "What standard makes lying acceptable?" one caller demanded. "My father wore the badge and told the truth. Are you saying that was modern?" another shouted. Even people who'd never trusted the police bristled at the word rewriting. This wasn't rewriting, it was finally reading the original draft. At a downtown diner, two retirees sat at a corner booth, forks paused midair as the television played footage of Earl walking slowly past reporters. "That's him," murmured one. The other nodded. "I always wondered why he left, thought he did something wrong." They ate in silence for a moment. "You ever think," the first said, "how many men like him we lost because they wouldn't bend?" The second didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the precinct, Officer Daniels was called into the captain's office again, this time not for questioning, but for a conversation that felt heavier. "You've become part of the story," the captain said. Daniel swallowed. "I didn't mean to." "No one ever does, but now you're going to be asked what side you're on." Daniels thought of Earl's eyes, calm, tired, unafraid. "I think," Daniels said slowly, "that maybe sides are why this happened." The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "That answer is going to cost you friends." Daniels shrugged. Truth already did. By afternoon, protests began, Not chaotic, not angry in the way headlines loved. They were quiet. Handwritten signs, folding chairs, people sitting. We remember. Integrity isn't new. Bring the records back. Earl watched from his porch as a small group gathered across the street, unsure whether to approach. A young woman stepped forward, holding a sign too big for her arms. "Mr. Thompson?" she called gently. "We just wanted you to know, my dad was on the force. He told me about you." Earl smiled. "I hope he told you the whole truth." She nodded. "He said you scared people because you wouldn't lie." Earl laughed, a short, surprised sound. "That's might be the nicest thing anyone said to me all week." That evening, the city council convened an emergency session. Public comment lasted 3 hours. Some spoke through tears, some through anger, some through the quiet resolve of people who had waited their turn for decades. One man approached the podium, voice steady. "I'm not here to condemn the police. I'm here to ask them to remember who they were supposed to be." The vote passed unanimously. An independent review, full transparency, records unsealed. Outside, someone rang a bell. At home, Earl sat at his kitchen table, the same one he'd eaten breakfast at for years, now cluttered with envelopes, letters from strangers, from former colleagues, from families who had lost something unnamed but familiar. One note stood out. "You taught my son that the badge could be gentle. He wears it now. Thank you." Earl folded the letter carefully. People still argue about whether cities can heal. Some say institutions are too old, too rigid. Others say truth is a luxury. But that night, as lights burned late in offices and living rooms across the city, something undeniable moved through the streets. Not justice yet, not closure, but acknowledgement. And for the first time in a long time, the city didn't look away.
By the third day, neutrality no longer existed. You were either speaking or you were being spoken about. Inside the precinct, the word "side" crept into conversations like a bad habit. Officers lowered their voices, not out of fear of criminals, but of each other. Locker doors stayed shut longer, coffee cups cooled, untouched. It wasn't anger that divided them, it was exposure. In the roll call room, Captain Reynolds stood at the podium, knuckles resting against the wood. He'd served 32 years, Vietnam vet, old school in the way that used to earn respect without explanation. Now, even he felt the ground shifting. "Listen up," he said. "This department is under a microscope. Every report, every stop, every decision. You follow procedure. You document everything. No shortcuts." Someone muttered, "Guess that's new." Reynolds ignored it. "And one more thing. Personal opinions stay personal. We don't argue this in uniform." A young officer raised her hand. "Sir, what about our conscience?" The room went still. Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "is why we're here." In the hallway afterward, 2 veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, pretending to study a bulletin board that hadn't changed in years. "They're tearing this place apart," one said. "No," the reply came. "They're turning the lights on." Across town, the backlash took on a different shape. Radio hosts fumed. "This is what happens when you let the past run the present, dragging good men through the mud because times changed." The phones lit up. A woman called in. Her voice shook, but it didn't waver. "Times didn't change, cameras did." The host cut her off. Social media moved faster than reason. Photos of Earl in uniform circulated, some praising, some mocking. Old arrest reports were screenshotted, misread, weaponized. People argued over details they didn't understand, with certainty they hadn't earned. Earl didn't look at any of it. He sat on his porch, same as always, watching the afternoon light stretch across the sidewalk. His neighbor, Mr. Collins, shuffled over with a newspaper folded under his arm. "They got your face on the front page again," Collins said. Earl smiled faintly. "At least they spelled my name right." Mr. Collins hesitated. "You holding up?" Earl thought about the weight in his chest, the memories resurfacing uninvited, the names he hadn't spoken of in years. I'm standing. That's enough for now. Inside City Hall, pressure mounted. The mayor's inbox overflowed, donors threatening to pull support, advocacy groups demanding firings, unions warning of strikes. Pick a lane, one advisor urged. The mayor stared at the screen. That's the problem. Every lane leads somewhere painful. In a closed-door meeting, Chief Whitaker faced his command staff. We cooperate fully, no exceptions. One deputy leaned forward. Even if it implicates former leadership? Whitaker met his gaze. Especially then. Another asked, and if it implicates us? Whitaker didn't flinch. Then we answer. Silence followed. Not agreement, respect. Elsewhere, Officer Daniels sat across from his father at a small kitchen table. His dad had retired from the force 15 years earlier, back when things were still simpler, as he liked to say. You're being talked about, his father said, not unkindly. People think you're siding against your own. Daniels stared into his coffee. I stopped a man for a broken taillight. I found out he'd been broken by the job I signed up for. His father sighed. You don't understand how it was back then. Daniels looked up. Did you? The question hung between them. His father's shoulders slumped slightly. I understood enough to keep my head down. Daniels nodded. I don't want to. Across the city, protests grew louder, and counter-protests formed just as quickly. Signs clashed. Honor the badge. Honor the truth. Police presence increased. Lines formed. Literal ones now. Barricades, yellow tape. Officers facing civilians who looked a lot like their parents. An older black man held up a sign that read, I remember Earl Thompson. A younger officer met his eyes, helmet slightly askew. For a moment, neither moved. Then the officer lowered his baton. In the precinct, internal affairs worked through the night. Files piled high, names repeated, patterns impossible to ignore. One investigator rubbed his eyes. This isn't just one era. His partner nodded. It's a habit. By midnight, 3 active officers were placed on administrative leave pending review, not for what they'd done recently, but for what they'd helped bury years ago. The union issued another statement. This department is eating itself alive. Earl watched the news quietly, the sound low. When the reporter asked whether he felt responsible for the turmoil, he answered simply, Truth doesn't cause storms, it just reveals where the roof was already weak. That night, a brick shattered the window of a community center hosting a forum on police accountability. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Lines weren't just drawn, they were being tested. In his office, Whitaker stared at a map of the city, red and blue pins marking protests, incidents, meetings. He thought of the badge pinned to his chest, the oath he'd taken. He thought of Earl, standing calm amid chaos. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, Whitaker made a call. Get me every file from 1972 to 85, unredacted. On the other end, a pause. Sir, that's going to upset a lot of people. Whitaker closed his eyes. They're already upset. Let's give them something worth being upset about. As dawn crept in, the city braced itself. Because once lines are drawn, someone has to decide whether to defend them or cross them.
The badge had always been heavy, but most officers learned how to carry it without feeling the weight. That illusion shattered the morning Chief Whitaker walked into the precinct holding a cardboard box. Inside it were files, not copies, not summaries, originals. He didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't need to. The sight of those folders, yellowed, thick, edges frayed by decades, sent a ripple through the building that no briefing ever could. By noon, word spread. The old cases were open, all of them. Men and women who'd worn the badge for 30, 40 years suddenly found themselves remembered not for what they'd done recently, but for what they'd allowed long ago. Officer Daniels felt it the moment he stepped into the locker room. The jokes were gone. So were the easy smiles. A few lockers sat empty, officers placed on leave overnight. Others stayed closed, untouched, like silent confessions. Daniels changed into his uniform slowly, feeling eyes on his back that hadn't been there before. Not angry, measuring. In the roll call room, Captain Reynolds stood again at the podium. His voice wasn't commanding today, it was tired. "Listen carefully," he said. "The review isn't about punishment, it's about responsibility." Someone scoffed quietly. Reynolds heard it. "If you think those are different things," he said, "you haven't been paying attention." A veteran officer raised his hand. "Sir, are we being judged by today's standards or yesterday's?" Reynolds didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "We're being judged by whether we knew better." Across town, Earl Thompson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, buttoning a shirt he hadn't worn in years. It was neatly pressed, light blue, a tie laid on the sink beside him. He hadn't planned on wearing it again, but the call had come that morning. "Mr. Thompson," the city clerk had said, voice formal but careful, "the department would like you to attend a closed hearing today. Your testimony may be required." Earl looked at the tie for a long moment. He thought of the first day he'd worn one like it, decades ago, standing proud in front of a camera that never bothered to write his name correctly. He picked it up. At City Hall, the chamber was closed to the public. No cameras, no speeches. Just people who could no longer hide behind noise. Chief Whitaker sat at the head of the table. Beside him, Internal Affairs. Across from them, officers, some retired, some active, their postures stiff, their eyes wary. Earl took a seat near the end. No badge, just a nameplate. Thompson, E. The first file was opened. A case from 1976, a traffic stop that escalated, a report rewritten 3 times, witness statements quietly removed, an officer cleared without explanation. The room was silent as the details unfolded. Then Whitaker spoke. "Officer Harris, do you recall this incident?" The man shifted. "Sir, that was almost 50 years ago." Whitaker nodded. "Do you recall whether force was used unnecessarily?" Harris hesitated. "I followed orders." Earl looked up. "Whose?" he asked, calmly. Harris didn't answer. The weight in the room grew heavier with each file. Patterns emerged. Same supervisors, same neighborhoods, same names showing up as witnesses or victims. When Earl's file was opened, the air changed. Not because it was worse, because it was cleaner, documented, detailed, meticulous. "They suspended him for insubordination," an investigator read aloud. "Reason, failure to comply with arrest quota adjustments." Earl cleared his throat. "I refuse to pad numbers." Whitaker looked at him. "And that cost you?" "Everything," Earl replied evenly. A younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, why didn't you say something sooner?" Earl met his eyes. "I did. No one listened." The hearing stretched into hours. Outside, officers waited, some pacing, some staring at phones they refused to unlock. Daniel stood near a window, watching rain begin to fall. His partner, Lopez, leaned against the wall beside him. "You okay?" Daniels nodded. "I think so." Lopez exhaled. "My dad worked under Harris." Daniels said nothing. "I don't know how to reconcile that," Lopez admitted. Daniels finally spoke. "You don't. You decide what you'll carry forward." Inside the chamber, the final file was closed.
Whitaker stood. This department has worn honor like a shield, but honor without truth is just armor, and armor doesn't protect the soul. Some faces hardened, others softened. Earl rose slowly. He hadn't planned to speak again, but the room waited. I loved this job. I loved what it could have been. He paused. The badge isn't heavy because it's metal. It's heavy because of the people it stands between. Silence followed. Then Whitaker nodded. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Outside City Hall, news had already leaked. Reporters gathered, protesters formed, police lines held, but thinner now. When Earl stepped out, someone called his name. He stopped. A young officer, barely 25, stood uncertainly at the edge of the crowd. Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. Earl studied him for a moment. For what? For making it harder, the officer said, but better. Earl smiled gently. That's the job. Back at the precinct, Whitaker addressed the department one final time that day. Some of you will retire with honor. Some of you will answer for what you did, and some of you will decide who we become next. He paused. The badge doesn't make you right, it just makes you responsible. That night, Daniels removed his badge at home and set it on the table. He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked it up again and pinned it back on, because the weight hadn't gotten lighter. But now, it meant something again.
Justice never arrives clean. It doesn't knock politely, it doesn't wait for comfort, and it never leaves things exactly as it found them. It came to the city slowly, like dawn after a long, restless night, revealing what had always been there. By the end of the week, the headlines had shifted, not screaming anymore, not speculating, confirming. Department admits to decades of misconduct. Former officer cleared, records amended. City Council orders independent oversight. The words felt heavy, final, like stones placed carefully on a grave. At City Hall, workers replaced a framed photograph near the main staircase, an old black and white image of uniformed men smiling beneath a banner that read, Tradition, Honor, Service. The new plaque beneath it read simply, Honor requires truth. Earl Thompson stood across the street that morning, leaning on his cane, watching city employees finish tightening the screws. For the first time in decades, his name appeared in public records not as a footnote, but as a correction. Wrongfully disciplined. Service record amended. Full benefits restored. A young clerk had handed him the documents the day before, eyes wide as if she were holding history itself. "I'm sorry it took so long," she'd said. Earl smiled softly. It always does. The city offered him compensation, a settlement, a formal apology signed and sealed. He accepted the apology. He donated most of the money. Because justice, he knew, wasn't about collecting. It was about closing a door so others didn't have to walk through it bleeding. Across town, Officer Daniels attended his first roll call under the new oversight rules. The room felt different, less rigid, more alert. Body cameras were checked twice, language protocols reviewed, use of force policies discussed openly, not as nuisances, but as responsibilities. A sergeant raised his voice once, sharply. Captain Reynolds stopped him. "Tone matters," he said calmly. "We don't win by sounding right. We win by being right." Some officers bristled. Others nodded. Change always asked a price, and not everyone was willing to pay it. 3 officers resigned quietly that month. 2 retired early. 1 was charged. No parades, no press conferences, just consequences. The department didn't collapse. It recalibrated.
Outside the precinct, a group of retired officers gathered one afternoon, men who had worn the badge during the same years Earl had. Some spoke bitterly, others stayed silent. One man finally said, "We did what we were taught." Another replied, "And we taught others." The silence after that was long and uncomfortable. Earl's house began receiving letters, handwritten ones, from former officers, from citizens, from young people who had read his name for the first time. One envelope stood out. Inside was a photograph, faded, creased. It showed Earl in uniform, standing beside a patrol car, smiling the way a man smiles when he believes the world might still bend toward good. A note was attached. "My father told me you saved his life once. I never knew your name until now. Thank you for standing when others sat down." Earl placed the photo on his mantel. Beside it, the badge he'd kept all these years. Not polished, not hidden, just honest. At City Council, debates grew louder. Funding shifted, training expanded, civilian oversight boards were formed. Some called it progress, others called it betrayal. A man shouted during a public hearing, "You're tearing this city apart." An elderly woman stood up after him. "No," she said quietly, "we're finally stitching it back together." The room erupted in applause. Justice didn't heal everything. It couldn't, but it stopped the bleeding. One afternoon, Daniels found himself assigned to a school visit, part of a new outreach initiative. He stood in a classroom of fifth graders, badge gleaming, explaining what police work was supposed to be. A little boy raised his hand. "My grandpa says cops don't listen," he said bluntly. Daniels nodded. "Sometimes we didn't," he admitted. "That's why we're learning to do better." The boy considered that, then nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. On a quiet Sunday, Earl walked through the park near his home. Children played, dogs barked, life continued. A young couple passed him, arguing softly about groceries. An officer jogged by, nodding respectfully. Earl returned the nod, not as a former officer, not as a symbol, as a man finally seen whole. He sat on a bench and closed his eyes, feeling the sun warm his face. For years, justice had felt like something theoretical, a word spoken loudly but practiced softly. Now it felt solid, imperfect, but present. That evening, the city held a small ceremony. No television cameras, no speeches longer than necessary. Chief Whitaker stood at the podium. "We cannot undo the past, but we can decide what we carry forward." He turned. "Mr. Thompson." Earl stepped forward. Whitaker handed him a framed document, not an award, a reinstatement. "Honorably retired." Applause filled the room, not roaring, not forced, but deep and steady. Earl spoke briefly. "I don't want to be remembered as a victim. I want to be remembered as someone who believed this job could be better." He paused. "And now," he added, "it is." Afterwards, Daniels approached him. "Sir, I just wanted you to know, I won't forget this." Earl smiled. Then justice didn't leave empty-handed. As night fell, the city lights flickered on. The same streets, the same buildings, but something had shifted. Justice didn't erase the past. It redefined the future. And what it left behind wasn't silence. It was responsibility.